You with Connect the World, I'm Becky Anderson. Now they have suffered the ravages of war and now it's getting worse. Displaced Sri Lankans already stuck in squalid camps must now endure the wrath of nature. It is, of course, monsoon season in the region. And as Sarah Seidner now tells us, torrential rain could turn a serious situation into utter disaster.
Flash floods in Sri Lanka leave hundreds homeless and searching for dry ground. Government-run television released video of conditions in the south of the country where an estimated 700 people have been displaced. What the video doesn't show are the conditions in Sri Lanka's north, left in ruins after decades of civil war. The area still heavily restricted for outsiders. There, more than 200,000 internally displaced people had only tents for shelter during the 3 days of torrential downpours. The UN says 2,000 tents were destroyed and people were forced to wade in mud and raw sewage from flooded toilets. According to an internal UN memo obtained by CNN, in one camp zone, the situation got so bad, reportedly more than 300 families gathered together to protest, prompting security forces to move in. It goes on to say if the rain continues, which is very likely, then the overall situation may go out of the control of management and lead to a serious security risk. Today, a Sri Lankan government official blamed aid agencies for some of the problems.
The sudden downpour caused flooding and the toilet pits to overflow. This would not have happened had the original suggestion made by the government to dig the pits deeper been followed by these agencies.
But Human Rights Watch blames the government for failing to release the war-affected citizens from substandard camps.
The main problem is that these people are being held as prisoners when they are, for the most part, civilians who are caught up in fighting. And if the government would just let them out, many of them would be able to go and stay with relatives or friends and have much better conditions.
But the government says it still has serious security concerns and must screen out violent rebels hiding in the masses. It has said it will resettle the Tamil civilians within a year. These camps were created because of a long and bloody war that raged for more than 25 years in the north. Using terrorist tactics, Tamil Tiger rebels fought for a separate homeland, saying they were discriminated against by the Sinhalese majority. In May, Sri Lanka declared it had won the war. Aid agencies say the big question now is, when will all the civilians who survived it get to live free lives? Sarah Seidner, CNN, New Delhi.
All right, well, Sarah's showed us just how difficult life is inside Sri Lanka. And now a warning from an American diplomat. I talked earlier to the US Assistant Secretary of State, Robert Blake. He says, without urgent action, the government in Sri Lanka risks losing international support.
The Sri Lankan government achieved a very important victory in defeating the Tamil Tigers, and the United States certainly welcomed that. But now it's very important that the government take urgent steps to win the peace. And I think there are really two categories of steps. First, as you say, to work as quickly as possible to resettle the more than 250,000 internally displaced persons who were still in the camps, but then also to take needed steps to achieve political reconciliation.
What sort of leverage do you think you have at this point?
Well, I think that there are a number of countries that have expressed their concern, that are important donors of Sri Lanka. And I think Sri Lanka wants to remain a respected member of the international community, wants to be seen as a country that is a pluralist, multi-ethnic state. So it has its own interests in taking the steps that we and others are advocating.
Will you prevent the aid getting to those who need it most if indeed the Sri Lankan government doesn't come good on what you hope they will?
Well, the United States has been one of the largest providers of humanitarian assistance. We've provided more than $60 million, primarily in food aid, but in other kinds of assistance for the internally displaced persons over the last 2 years. And in terms of our future assistance, a lot will depend on the steps that Sri Lanka does take in the two areas that I mentioned.
The Sri Lankan authorities say that they do plan to let civilians return home from these camps, but they say they must screen them first to identify any rebel fighters. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that there are a certain number of former LTT combatants who are still in the camps. Many of them took off their uniforms and essentially blended in with the internally displaced persons. So I think it is important to have a process to try to separate them out and to provide them with rehabilitation and an opportunity to start new lives.
And finally, what does the US do if the Sri Lankan government fails to share power with the minority Tamils?
We have told our friends in the Sri Lankan government that the more progress they make in resettling the internally displaced persons from the camps and the more progress they make on political reconciliation, the more the United States and probably other donors as well will be able to make available assistance for reconstruction, which is urgently needed in the northern part of Sri Lanka.
This sounds like a threat.
We don't make threats. Sri Lanka is a friend of the United States, and there are a number of people in our society, both in the NGO community, but also in our U.S. Congress and in our own administration, who are very concerned about the situation there. And we make clear what our interests are, and the Sri Lankan government has its own interests, and we do our best to try to reconcile those. But at the end of the day, each state is a sovereign government, and we'll make our own decisions.
All right, you've heard the thoughts there of the US Assistant Secretary of State. So let's get the response then from Sri Lanka's government, shall we? We spoke with Sri Lanka's ambassador to the United States. He discussed the obstacles facing his government in resettling those displaced people and urged the world to be patient.
We have already settled over 10,000, 15,000 people. We have planned to settle another 15,000 families. That's about maybe 40,000 people during coming weeks. But thing is, some areas are heavily mined, most of the areas, but we need to do the demining, which we have already started with the support of India, Japan, and in fact Australia gave some equipment recently, and the US is going to support us. And until we do the demining, we can't put the people back at their homes. And also, some areas have been buried by the LTT, landmines, in addition to landmines, weapons, mortars, and a lot of other stuff, because it's for safety of the people. So President has come out with a 180-day plan, and it's going very well. So I think if everything goes well, we could finish everything within the next 6 months as he planned.
All right, well, that's the complex diplomacy, isn't it? Let's get back to the weather, though, shall we? Because that's what's going to affect some 250,000 people living in squalid conditions in these camps in Sri Lanka as we speak. Let's take a look at the monsoon rains deluging Sri Lanka at the moment. Will it get worse? That's the question, isn't it? And when will it end? Well, for some answers, let's bring in Guillermo Arduino.